بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ولي الأولين والآخرين وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. أيها الإخوة, in the previous series of lessons we finished studying Al-Qawa'id Al-Arba by Sheikh Al-Mujaddid Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, and now we move on to the next series of lessons, the next Risala, which, as has been advertised, is in explaining Al-Usool Ath-Thalaatha or Thalathatul Usool wa Adillatuha by the same author, Al-Imam Al-Mujaddid Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. And because the workbooks have not been printed, I think if you make notes from today's lesson, and then when you do get the workbooks, if you copy your notes, inshallah, because as you know, in the beginning of the next lesson I'll be testing everybody and we'll be covering everything which we studied previously. Also, we have a gift for you, and that is an exam from Al-Qawa'id Al-Arba, and that you can do in your own times, inshallah. That we can do in your own times, inshallah. So firstly, today's lesson, because the workbooks, we have the workbooks, we'll do an introduction in today's lesson. This treatise, Al-Usool Ath-Thalaatha or Thalathatul Usool, it is a treatise which the author he wrote, and he did not write it for Tullab al-Ilm. He wrote and authored this treatise for the common Muslim. In order for the common Muslim to understand the most basic principles and foundations of the religion of Al-Islam. Meaning, he rahimahullah, he wrote this Risala for the common average Muslim at that time in Najd and in those areas. So, if they understand this Risala, they will be saved from the punishment and the questioning in the grave. And how do we know that? Because the three principles which are mentioned in this treatise, they are the three questions in the grave. In the grave, each person, what will he be asked? Who knows? In the grave, each person, what will the question be? Who knows? Man Rabbuka wa ma dinuka wa man nabiyyuk. What is your, who is your Lord? What is your religion? And who is your Prophet? Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Of course, these questions, they are not questions like an exam, like you just take or write the answer, but who is your Lord, and did you worship your Lord? And what is your religion, and did you live according to that religion? And who is your Prophet, and did you follow him? So those questions in the grave, they are not a questions of knowing or not knowing. They are questions of knowing and implementing. So even if somebody theoretically knows the answer, but he did not live and implement the answers, he will not be able to answer those questions. So the point is that the author rahimahullah, he authored this treatise for the average common Muslim in order for him to learn the answers to those three questions and then to live by them, hoping that the one who does learn them and the one who knows them and the one who lives according to them or by them will be saved in the grave. And fearing upon a person who is ignorant of these questions or knows them and does not live by them, that he will fail the test in the grave and therefore face punishment in the grave. So this Risala, what does it contain? As I mentioned, it contains the most basic principles of the religion which every single Muslim has to know. In terms of knowing Allah, and the different types of worship, knowing the deen and the different levels of the deen, and knowing the Prophet ﷺ, the most basic aspects from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, which every single Muslim should know. And this risala, it gained a lot of popularity and prominence because of, firstly, although it is a simple treatise, but it is very comprehensive. You will see it is very comprehensive. It is comprehensive and yet concise. Its language is easy for the common Muslim to understand, meaning in Arabic, because it was written for the common Muslim. It was not written for the ulama, the qudat, or the tulab al-ilm. It's also, and one of the distinctions of this risala is the sheer number of evidences. If a person was to write down, and if a person was to separate the words of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab and the evidences which he mentioned, at least 60-70% of the risala is actually evidences. So the majority of this risala is not even his own words. They are the words of Allah, the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His own words are half or maybe a minority of the risala. And of course, because of the topic and the subject of the risala, this is why it is important. Because every single person needs to know these things in order to be saved from the questioning in the grave. And this is the reason why so many ulama, they attach importance to it in terms of teaching it, explaining it, getting the students to memorize it, and listening to the students, reading it, and also how much popularity it has. Again, there are so many written explanations, so many recorded explanations of Al-Usool Al-Thalatha. So many Dawrat al-Ilmiya in which Al-Usool Al-Thalatha it is taught. In fact, it is well known that in Saudi Arabia, only 20-30 years ago, this risala used to be taught in every single masjid to all the attendees. And we're talking about the common attendee, the common person who comes for the salah. They were all taught and they would memorize this risala. And a Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Sheikh, and he was the Mufti of Saudi Arabia from before Ibn Abbaas. In one of his fatawa, or his role as the Mufti, he directed every single imam that the curriculum of every single masjid in Saudi Arabia, it is Al-Usool Al-Thalatha. Every single imam in every single masjid had to have a lesson teaching this book and making sure that the attendees, remember, we're not talking about Tulab al-Ilm, the old and the young and whoever's attending, all of them have to know and memorize Al-Usool Al-Thalatha. So this is only 40-50 years ago that this was done. And this was the common practice throughout Saudi Arabia, especially Najd and Riyadh and those places. Now you'll notice that when I refer to the title of the treatise, I said Usool Al-Thalatha, and then I said Thalathatul Usool. And this is because this treatise, sometimes people call it Al-Usool Al-Thalatha, and sometimes people call it Thalathatul Usool wa Adillatuha, the three principles and their evidences. What's famous is Al-Usool Al-Thalatha. However, the reality is that these are two different treatises. There is one treatise called Al-Usool Al-Thalatha, and there is another treatise called Thalathatul Usool wa Adillatuha. And even though we call this one Al-Usool Al-Thalatha, that's what's known and famous, however, that's actually a different treatise. Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, he wrote another treatise for young children, and he wrote it in a question answer format, like this, Man Rabbuk Ma Dinuk, like that, in the same format. And that he called Al-Usool Al-Thalatha. And that treatise, it's more concise, simpler, and it contains less knowledge or less tafasil, less details. So the actual name of this risala which we are studying is Thalathatul Usool wa Adillatuha. And then there is another risala with a similar title, which is basically the same Al-Usool, except that the author wrote it in Amiyah. You know Amiyah, which is the slang or the colloquial language of the Arabs. He wrote it for the most common Muslim. For example, instead of saying manro, instead of saying ma dinuk, ish dinuk. Now, he wrote it in colloquial language, so even a person who is considered to be less educated or illiterate, even that person can understand. Now, in terms of, and we always do this, before we read and study this Risala, let's provide a context by at least knowing what the Risala contains. What are the different sections of the Risala? So firstly, there is an introduction. And in this introduction, the author mentions the obligation upon every single Muslim throughout his life. Now, your life mission as a Muslim, what is it? And he mentions 4 things. As a Muslim, your life mission is 4 things. Al-ilm, wal-amal, wal-da'wa, wal-sabr. Knowledge, righteous actions, calling to Allah, and patience. This is the first section of Al-Usool Ath-Thalaatha, the introduction, and the introduction mentions the life goal, the goal of a Muslim throughout his life. Your mission, your project throughout your life, what you have to continue doing are these 4 things. Seeking knowledge, performing righteous actions, calling to Islam, and being patient in all of this. And of course, he gives the evidence for this. The next section, he mentions 3 matters which every single person of Tawheed has to understand. 3 matters which every single person of Tawheed has to understand. And that is firstly, that Allah did not create us without a purpose. Rather, He created us for a purpose, and He sent prophets and messengers to explain that purpose to us. This is the first matter we have to understand. Allah places upon this earth for a purpose. How do we know what that purpose is? He sent a messenger to explain to us what that purpose is. Secondly, the second matter, that Allah detests and despises every type of shirk, regardless of who the or what the deity is. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's an angel that a person is worshipping. It doesn't matter whether it's a prophet or a wali or a salih or a murshid that a person is ascribing to Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala detests every type of shirk, regardless of who the deity is. And then the third matter, which is imperative for us to understand, is that it's not possible for a person of Tawheed, a person of ittiba', and the one who worships Allah alone and follows the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's not possible for that person to then love, adore, support those who are enemies to Allah and His Messenger. It's not possible for a person of Tawheed to be upon Tawheed except through hating shirk, the people of shirk, the actions of shirk, and the festivals of shirk. So these are 3 matters imperative upon every single person of Tawheed. So this is like a second principle. The first principle, the life goal of a Muslim. 4 things: knowledge, actions, calling to Allah, and patience. The second introduction, we said 3 matters which every single person of Tawheed has to understand. Allah created us for a purpose. He explained the purpose was mentioned by the prophets. Allah does not accept shirk, regardless of what the object of shirk is. And thirdly, it's not possible for a person of Tawheed and ittiba' to love and support those who are enemies to Allah and His Messenger. Then there's a third introduction. And in the third introduction, and we haven't entered the Risala yet. We've not entered the Risala. The third introduction is the meaning of Al-Hanifiyya and the greatest obligation in Al-Islam and the most severe prohibition in Al-Islam. This is the third muqaddimah. What is Al-Hanifiyya? What is the greatest obligation you have to fulfill? And what is the worst sin that you have to stay away from? And these are muqaddimat. These are introductions before the author enters into the actual three principal, either three questions in the grave. Some of the ulama mention that these three introductions which I have just mentioned, they are not actually part of the text Usool Ath-Thalaatha. They said that the author, he wrote a treatise Al-Usool Ath-Thalaatha which begins with Man Rabbuk. And these introductions, the students of the Shaykh, they took from some of his other writings and they added it into Al-Usool Ath-Thalaatha. Because the students of the Shaykh in those days, the students of Imam Muhammad ibn Wahhab rahimahullah, once they would send his Risala to the various areas, to the various Masajid, ordering the Tullab al-Ilm to teach these Rasail. So sometimes they would take his Risala, and if they saw something beneficial written by him in some of his other treatises, then they would add it as an introduction to this Risala. So some of them mention this, that his actual Usool Ath-Thalaatha begins with what is the first principle. And these introductions, yes, they are his words, but they have been collected from other Rasail and added to this Risala. Then after this, the next section is the actual Risala itself. Firstly, Al-Aslul Awwal Ma'rifatullah. The first principle, a person knowing his Lord. And the author mentions under this principle the obligation of knowing Allah and worshipping Allah upon Tawheed and the different types of ibadah and evidences for these ibadat. So he mentions, for example, dua, tawakkul, raja, isti'ana, isti'adha, istighatha, al-dhabh, al-nadhar, al-raghba, al-rahba, al-khawf, al-mahabba. All of these are types of ibadat which we have to single out to Allah with. We'll cover all of them inshallah what they mean. Then he mentions the second principle, which is ma'rifatud deen. And in the second principle he mentions the three levels of the deen. What are the three levels of our religion? Islam, and then Iman, and then Ihsan. So Islam is the most basic, apparent level of our religion. And when I say apparent, meaning what we can see. Meaning, how do you judge somebody is a Muslim? By what you can see. You can't delve into his heart. You cannot check his Iman. You cannot check his intention. You can only go by that which you see. If you see from a person Islam, we say he's a Muslim. Inside him, he might be a munafiq. We don't know. We cannot test or insult or have suspicions regarding a person's Iman. We look at that which is apparent, and based upon that we say this person is a Muslim. And that is the level of Islam. The basic level from what we can see, Salah, Zakah, Ramadan, Sawm, Hajj. The most basic level we see, and we say this person is a Muslim. Then he explained the next higher level, which is Al-Iman. And then he explained the highest level, which is Al-Ihsan. We'll explain all of this. And in each level, he mentions the pillars and the evidences. Meaning, what is Islam? What is the definition of Islam? What is the meaning and the understanding of Islam? What are the pillars of Islam, Arkanul Islam, and what are the evidences? Similarly, when it comes to Iman, what is Iman? What what is the definition or the understanding of Al-Iman, what are the pillars of Al-Iman, and what are the evidences of Al-Iman. And similarly, Al-Ihsan. What is Al-Ihsan? What is the definition of Ihsan? What are the pillars of Al-Ihsan? And what are the evidences of Al-Ihsan? All of this is mentioned. And then he mentions the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, the long hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam. And all of that is the second principle, Al-Asl Al-Thani. Then the next section is the third principle, which is Ma'rifatun Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, knowing the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And again he mentions from the seerah the basics of what every single Muslim has to know. The basics of what every single Muslim has to know regarding the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So he mentions his name, he mentions his nasab, meaning his lineage. He mentions his country and his age. He mentions his da'wah, and he mentions his death, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Brothers, don't look at the books, just write. Close the book. Just write. He mentions, we said, his name, his lineage, his land, his migration, his da'wah, and his death, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And then these are the three principles, and now we come to the ending of the Risala. In the ending of the Risala, the author mentions the completion and the perfection of the religion, and the obligation of the ummah, or the obligation upon the ummah after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He mentions in the ending the completion and the perfection of the religion, and then the obligation upon us after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he mentions the legislation of hijrah. He mentions al-Iman in the final day and the resurrection. And then he ends by mentioning the two pillars of Tawheed, and that is rejecting the false deities and having Iman in Allah. He ends by mentioning the two pillars of Tawheed, and that is rejecting the false deities, the Taghut, and having an Iman in Allah. And he mentions who are the Taghut and what are the different levels of the Tawaghit. So this is a very brief breakdown of the Risala. Now, so we understand the context of the Risala before we begin to read it in detail. Previously, when we spoke about Al-Qawaid Al-Arba'a, we spoke about the literary style of Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, and how his writings differ so much from Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. And that is that and his writings, they differ so much from Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, not because he could not write like that, but because of the intended audience and the need of the society at that time. So during the time of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, shirk, meaning shirk in uluhiyya, shirk in rububiyyah, the worshipping of the dead and the awliya and the people in the grave and the jinns and slaughtering animal in other than the name of Allah, this was very, very little. And it was not known that people do this. It existed, but it wasn't as rampant as it is today, or as was it during the time of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. But during the time of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, the major problem of the ummah and that surrounding area was shirk in rububiyyah and al-uluhiyyah. And so you see many of the writings of the Imam are regarding Tawheed and shirk. And because this shirk was at the level of the common Muslim, like in some of the Muslim countries today, he wrote in a language, in a style which the common Muslim understands. Whereas if you look at the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, many of their books were written for ulama, to be utilized by the ulama in refuting the doubts of Ahlul Kalam and Al-Mu'tazila and Ahl al-Falsafa and the philosophers and so on and so forth. So this is why there's a difference in the literary style of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. And you find from the writings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah that they are often to the point, meaning it is the mas'ala and the evidence, the point and the evidence. Whereas if you read the books of Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahimahullah, in many of his answers, he's asked a question, he begins answering the question, then he mentions many other principles from different areas of the deen, and then towards the end he comes back to the question, he answers the question again, maybe like pages afterwards, then he brings it back to the question. Muhammad ibn Wahhab rahimahullah, his writings are not like that. His writings are very direct. The question is asked, the answer is given with its evidence. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why his books and his rasail are more accessible to the common Muslim, more beneficial to the common Muslim. Also, you'll see from the writings of Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah that they deal with real issues. I mean, when he gives examples of shirk, these are not examples he's made up. These are examples which actually existed during his time. He saw this happening and then he wrote about it. And that's clear because those same examples are happening today in some of our countries, and these rasail apply. Yani, for example, trees from which strings are hung or shoes are hung, hoping for good luck. Now this happens. This happens in many of the Muslim countries. Calling out to Badawi and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein and Al-Jilani, this happens. So when he gave examples and he dealt with certain doubts, is because he saw those doubts, he saw those examples, and then he wrote to solve that problem. Now, to give some guidance regarding that issue. And this is why these rasail are very appropriate, especially in our time and to many of our countries. For example, let's take Pakistan as an example. What you see in the villages of Pakistan today, that is exactly what was occurring in Najd during the time of Al-Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. So just as those rasail were beneficial for that time, they are also appropriate and beneficial for today. And then after this, the right of the author is that we know something about his life. This is the right of the author upon us. At the least, we know something about his life. So he is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab ibn Sulaiman ibn Ali At-Tamimi. He is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab ibn Sulaiman ibn Ali At-Tamimi. And At-Tamimi meaning he is from Banu Tamim. He is from the tribe of Bani Tamim. And this tribe, Bani Tamim, is a well-known famous tribe. And there were many from the Sahaba who were from this tribe, Bani Tamim. And some of the enemies of the Shaykh, of the Da'wah, they try to spread doubts regarding the Shaykh. If they cannot refute evidences, they'll mention doubts. They'll say that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he came from Najd. And the Prophet ﷺ said that fitna will come from Najd. And he was referring to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. However, the same person, he was from Bani Tamim. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah was from Bani Tamim. And the virtues of Bani Tamim have been mentioned in authentic hadith. The hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, and the hadith is in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said, or rather Abu Hurairah said, مَا زِلْتُ أُحِبُّ بَنِي تَمِيمٍ مُنْذُ ثَلَاثٍ. I have never stopped loving Bani Tamim since three matters which the Prophet ﷺ mentioned or happened. I have never stopped loving Bani Tamim since three things which I saw. سمعتها من رسول الله. I heard these three matters being mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. Firstly, the Prophet ﷺ said, Hum ashaddu ummati ala dajjal. That Bani Tamim will be the most severe people upon Dajjal. The second matter, Ja'at sadaqatuhum. They charity from Bani Tamim, zakat from Bani Tamim, it came to us. And the Messenger ﷺ said, Hadihi sadaqatu qawmina. This is the charity of our people, meaning Bani Tamim. And the third matter, that there was a prisoner of war from Banu Tamim, and she was a maid with Aisha radiallahu anha. And the Prophet ﷺ ordered Aisha, he said, A'taqiha فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ وَلَدِ Ismail. Free her, emancipate her, because she is from the progeny of Ismail, and she was a girl who was from Bani At-Tamim. So, and we don't mention this because we cannot take a hadith and say this refers to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. But the point is that if those people want to mention regarding Najd and that those hadith Najd refer to him, then they should also mention that he's from Banu Tamim. And the virtues of Bani Tamim therefore also apply to him, rahimahullah, rahmatan wasi'ah. And he was born 115 Hijri, 1115 Hijri, which corresponds to 1703. 1703 from the Gregorian calendar. Meaning today is 2024. So 1703, how many years? 321 years. No, 321 years ago. And he was born in a city called Al-Uyayna, which is not too far away from Al-Riyadh. And Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, he was born in a family of knowledge. His father was a qadi, his grandfather was also well-known alim, a mufti, a qadi, and they were well known for fiqh in the Hanbali madhab. And he memorized the Qur'an before the age of 10, and he studied tafsir and fiqh and the other sciences of Islamic knowledge with his father, his grandfather, and then the scholars of that area. And then after this, Imam Muhammad ibn Wahhab rahimahullah, when he was young, he travelled to Makki, he travelled to Al-Madinah, he travelled to Basra, he travelled to Al-Ahsa in order to seek knowledge from the scholars who are there. And then, when he came back from seeking knowledge from his travels, and he saw the shirk which was rampant amongst many of the common Muslims, the graves, the trees, the sihr, the jinn, the shayateen, etc., then he began to warn the people. And so the tribes, they turned on him, and they would exile him from one town to another town, until he met the Amir of a particular tribe. And that Amir, his name was Muhammad ibn Saud. That Amir, his name was Muhammad ibn Saud. And this was in a city called Ad-Dir'iyya. And so Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, with his knowledge, and Muhammad ibn Saud with his strength in terms of an army and soldiers, etc., they then came together, and Muhammad ibn Saud, he protected Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, and he allowed for the da'wah to flourish, and then that da'wah, it spread throughout what is today known as Saudi Arabia and some of the surrounding areas. And when the first Saudi state was formed, incidentally there were 3 Saudi states. There wasn't one Saudi state, there were 3 Saudi states. The first Saudi state was under Imam Muhammad ibn Saud and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. And the agreement between them was that Muhammad ibn Saud would take care of the logistics, the organization of the Saudi state, and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the scholars, they would be in charge of da'wah and they would be in charge of finances. So Baytul Mal and the treasury, and what we call the treasury, this was all under the ulama and under Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, not under Muhammad ibn Saud. And Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, after a while, he gave that up and he gave the treasury back to Muhammad ibn Saud rahimahullah. Why? To concentrate on knowledge and da'wah and let them take care of the money and the finances and the running of the country. And then that first Saudi state, it was then attacked and it was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Ottomans and the Pashas of Egypt and the Sharifs of Al-Hijaz. And then the second Saudi state rose, and then it became established. Then after a while, it was also destroyed due to fighting by the Ottomans, etc. And then Malik Abdul Aziz rahimahullah came, and then he established at that time, after the first Saudi state was destroyed, many of the ulama were taken, they were exiled into different areas. And they were taken to Egypt, and many of them were shot. Is a firing line? They were placed against the wall, and all of them were shot in one go. And similarly, with the second Saudi state, the ulama were taken, they were shot, they were exiled. The family of Saud were exiled in the area which what we know today as Al-Kuwait. And then finally, Malik Abdul Aziz rahimahullah, he came, and then he once again took control, and the third time the Saudi state was finally established. And the ulama also gained prominence, and this is why any Saudi alim who has the name Al-Sheikh, it means Al-Sheikh means family of the Sheikh, meaning they are descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. So for example, the Mufti today, Sheikh Abdul Aziz Al-Sheikh, he's from one of the great grandsons of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah. And the Imam, he passed away and he was 88 years old. And some of the books and the Rasail of the Imam, you know, Kitab al-Tawheed, Al-Usool, Kashf al-Shubhat, etc. Of course, he has books on Aqidah, he has books on Fiqh, he has books on Seerah, he has books on Hadith, he has Fatawa, many books that he has. So that is the introduction to Al-Usool, Ath-Thalaatha, or Thalathatul Usool wa Adillatuha. And I wanted to take a break, and then I wanted to start reading the Risala, but because the workbooks have not been printed and you won't be able to take notes, we'll leave that to the next lesson, inshallah. However, as I mentioned, there is an exam here. Now, with regards to this exam is from Al-Qawaid Al-Arba. And what you can do is, you can look at the questions on the exam. Now, look at the questions, no problem. Then put it away and then go revise your notes. Then once you start the exams, then you don't look at the notes. So you can look at the exam and you can read your notes and revise whatever you want to do. But once the exam has started, then you close your notes and then you answer the questions. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ghashana falaysa minna." Whoever cheats is not from us. Now, so if you cheat, you're only cheating yourself. So anyway, I'll give this as a homework to you, inshallah, for next lesson. Or if you've got your notes now, and if you want to revise your notes and answer the questions, it's up to you, inshallah. Is any sister you saw the sister upstairs or? I mean, yeah, then give them the example of this.